Nomination, Federal Maritime Commission, Max Vegich of Washington to be a Federal Maritime Commissioner.
You ready? No, I'm not speaking. Oh, okay. You just passed the... Oh, congratulations. I'm going to try and move.
Senator from New Hampshire is recognized.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to support three extraordinarily qualified Department of Defense nominees. Melissa Dalton to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Hemispheric Affairs, Dr. David Honey to be Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, and Dr. Celeste Wallander to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. These three individuals have been nominated to serve in critical national security positions, and they are tasked with confronting those challenges of national security and securing U.S. interests at home and abroad. As a senior member of the Armed Services Committee, I attended the committee nomination hearings for all three nominees, and I came away convinced that all three were qualified for their positions and deserving of swift confirmation. Melissa Dalton previously served as a career civil servant in various positions at the Department of Defense for a decade under both President Bush and President Obama, so she had bipartisan support clearly in that position. She also was a senior fellow and director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. If confirmed, one of Ms. Dalton's core responsibilities as Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense would be overseeing the department's ability to operate through impacts to critical infrastructure, an area in which we have increasingly seen our adversaries are trying to exploit, particularly through cyber attacks. As Ms. Dalton has said, the resilience of our capabilities and infrastructure at home strengthens deterrence of aggression abroad, and DoD must be able to demonstrate its resilience. The recent news of increased threats from Russia's cyber attacks associated with their unprecedented troop buildup near Ukraine underscores the need for this position to be filled as quickly as possible. I also want to express my support for Dr. David Honey, who has dedicated a lifetime of service to the defense of this country. Dr. Honey has served in various research and development positions at the Department of Defense, including roles at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, which is so important to our innovation. He's also served on the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research. Today, more than ever, we need talented, qualified individuals like Dr. Honey at the forefront of DoD's innovation and technological efforts. Seemingly every few weeks, we hear in the press about shocking technological breakthroughs made by the Chinese military that raise concerns about eroding our technological advantage. Former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hyten, described the Chinese test of a fractional orbital bombardment system last summer as stunning. Our technological advantage has been a foundational part of deterrence for decades, and if lost, it would be enormously destabilizing for global security. But if we are truly committed to preserving our defense technological superiority, it's vital that we confirm Dr. Honey as quickly as possible. Finally, I want to speak to support Dr. Celeste Wallander, who is the nominee to serve as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. And as part of that role, she is responsible for defense policy toward Europe, NATO, the Middle East, and Africa, all places right now which are hotbeds of potential conflict. In light of the ongoing and unprecedented Russian threat to post-Cold War European stability and Ukrainian sovereignty, Dr. Wallander's nomination comes at a particularly critical time. Dr. Wallander has demonstrated a history of expertise on Russia. As former president of the U.S.-Russia Foundation, top Russian expert on the National Security Council, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, Dr. Wallander is highly respected on both sides of the aisle. With a bipartisan delegation, I traveled to Ukraine several weeks ago. We met with Ukrainian President Zelensky and his national security team to discuss the Russian threat and how we can do everything possible to help our Ukrainian friends. You can't turn on the radio, read a paper, or watch the news at night without seeing the Russian troops who are massed on Ukraine's border. And the message from the Ukrainians was clear when we met with them. They see their future in partnership with the West. They share our democratic values, and their people are proud of their hard-won independence. And every step that Putin takes toward escalating the situation at the border is a step closer to threatening not only Ukraine's future, but the liberal democratic system that he fears and that we all have benefited from. I can think of no one more qualified for this position at DoD at this time of immense instability than Dr. Wallander. So, for these reasons, I believe we must move to confirm these three nominees as quickly as possible so they can fulfill the duties of these crucial positions that are so vital to our national security. So with that, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of the following nominations en bloc. Calendar numbers 476, 692, 694. That the Senate vote on the nominations en bloc without intervening action or debate. The motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. That any statements related to the nominations be printed in the record. That the President be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. Here we are 6 months since the last foreign policy disaster in which this administration led this country, the disastrous withdrawal of Afghanistan, 13 service members killed, including one from my home state of Missouri, dozens more wounded, hundreds of civilians killed, hundreds more, maybe thousands of American civilians left behind enemy lines to terrorists to fend for themselves, still hundreds of Americans stranded there in Afghanistan as we speak. And what accountability has there been in this time? Who has been relieved of duty? Who has been shown the door? What have we learned? The answer is there's been no accountability. No one has been relieved of duty. No one has been shown the door. And now this administration has bumbled to the brink of another foreign policy crisis that they have helped create, having denied Ukraine military aid, lethal aid when it asked for it last spring, having stuffed dollars in Vladimir Putin's pockets by greenlighting the Nord Stream 2 energy pipeline. And now here they are on the verge of another foreign policy crisis. And still we have no answers, still we have no accountability. I will say this, though. We did learn a few interesting details this week about what happened in Afghanistan. And by the way, if you think that Vladimir Putin and the other dictators around this world weren't emboldened by this administration's weakness, by their utter failure in Afghanistan, then you've got another thing coming. But what did we learn this week about Afghanistan? Well, we learned actually a couple of interesting things, a number of interesting things. We learned that, in fact, the White House and the State Department were warned for months on end, that their failure to evacuate civilians would result in disaster, that the Afghan government was on the verge of collapse. They were told over and over. One service member who was in Kabul told investigators, the writing was on the wall, I'm quoting now, the writing was on the wall. The country and its government were actively collapsing, and we should not have waited to start evacuations until every provincial capital had fallen except for Kabul. And yet that's exactly what the administration did. Our top military commander in Kabul tried to get the ambassador on the ground to see the security threat for what it was, but to no avail. As one military official told investigators, we learned this week, the embassy needed to position for withdrawal, and yet they weren't doing it. Why weren't they doing it? Why weren't civilians evacuated in a timely manner? Why wasn't the White House prepared? Because the White House wasn't taking it seriously. According to Marine Corps Brigadier General Farrell Sullivan, as late as August the 6th, the National Security Council, and I'm quoting him now, was not seriously planning for an evacuation. Mind you, by this point, our military presence is gone. We have withdrawn militarily from the country. Here we are in August, and the National Security Council, the White House, was not seriously planning for an evacuation. The State Department hadn't even put a team together that was responsible for informing individuals, including American citizens, that they were eligible for evacuation, or started collecting the information they would need to put those Americans on flights to safety. And it wasn't as if the White House and the State Department didn't know better. Our top military commander on the ground in Afghanistan warned as early as March, he has testified, that he said the security situation in Afghanistan was dire and collapse could come quickly. When the United States withdrew, collapse could come quickly. He said it in March. By July, our troops are gone. In August, the administration still hasn't started planning. Here's what the top commander in Kabul said. He said, I think we could have been much better prepared to conduct a more orderly evacuation. Civilian evacuation, that's what a NEO is, if policymakers had paid attention to the indicators of what was happening on the ground and the timelines associated with the Taliban advance and the Taliban intent to conduct a military takeover. That's what we learned this week, that the White House was told over and over and over again and did nothing. In fact, worse than that, rejected the council of military commanders on the ground, saying that the situation was urgent, saying that civilians needed to be evacuated, saying that there needed to be other steps taken, new measures taken, and the White House drugged their feet, did nothing. And so what was the consequence of that? Well, we also learned this week that the consequence was a rapid, chaotic rush for the exits once the White House suddenly and belatedly realized they'd bumbled into a crisis. Once they realized that they had left American civilians with nowhere to go. Once they realized that they had a collapse on their hands that they had not planned for, despite being warned repeatedly. As the CENTCOM found, Central Command found, and we learned this week, commanders at each gate around the airport exercised authority to open or close their respective gates as they deemed appropriate, according to the situation on the ground. However, there was tremendous pressure from the strategic level, meaning the combatant command, the Joint Staff, and yes, the White House, to continue to process and evacuate civilians to the maximum extent possible, so the gate closures were done rarely, locally, and temporarily. In other words, it was a rush, a mad rush to the exits once the administration realized that, in fact, the government was collapsing, realized they hadn't done the preparation they needed to do, realized that hundreds, if not thousands, of American civilians were in grave danger, and we know the result of that. The result is 13 service members were killed. Hundreds of civilians were killed, and hundreds of Americans, maybe more, were left behind to the enemy. Now, I said we learned all this week. You might wonder, well, where did we learn it? I mean, maybe at least we're making some progress. We're getting some accountability. We've learned something. Did we learn it in an oversight hearing before this body? Did we learn it in sworn testimony given in public on the evacuation of Afghanistan? No. Oh, no. No, we learned it from a press report. We learned it because the Washington Post obtained what were previously confidential, unpublished, non-public reports from within the military, from within Central Command in particular. and the Washington Post published them. So, Mr. President, in what has become an all too typical scenario, we learn nothing from any hearings this body is doing because they aren't doing any in public. What we learn is entirely from leaked reports, secondhand sources, the public having been shut out, having been denied access. You know, we had multiple hearings, actually, or briefings on Afghanistan and the security situations in Ukraine last week. Did they happen in public? No. Was there testimony taken in public? No. Were there questions asked by senators in public? No. Mr. President, I'm willing to come to this floor as long as it takes and insist on regular order as long as it takes until there is accountability for what this administration has done in Afghanistan and now what it's bumbling towards in Ukraine. We have got to get answers. Why is it that commanders on the ground warn over and over that disaster is imminent and the White House does nothing? Why is it that the White House and the State Department deny the request for a civilian evacuation? Why is it that we are still here all these months later and the only answers we can get are from leaked reports in the press? Why has not this body done its job to conduct rigorous and serious oversight hearings in public for the American people to see? I will come to this floor and insist on regular order, insist this body do its job and vote on Defense Department nominees until we get accountability, until there are public hearings, and until we can learn what actually happened in Afghanistan and who is responsible. Because I tell you this, I wasn't alive for Vietnam, but I am not willing to participate in the kind of cover-up that happened for years in the Vietnam War. I am not willing to kick this oversight responsibility off to some commission that won't report for years from now, most of its findings probably in a classified annex, and by that point somebody will say, oh, well, it's just too late to do anything about it. The American public was lied to for years in the Vietnam War. It has been lied to for years with Afghanistan, and it is time to get answers. And so, yes, I will be here insisting on those answers, insisting on oversight, and insisting on accountability until we get it. And until that time, it is not too much to ask the Senate to do its job. I believe the majority leader said just the other day that the Senate is here to vote. That's what the Senate's here to do. Well, that's an apt phrase, Mr. President. And for once, I agree very much with the Senate majority leader. And for those reasons, I object.
Mr.
Objection
President.
is heard. The senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I appreciate my colleague's grandstanding on Afghanistan when he knows that in the NDAA we passed a provision to create a commission to look at Afghanistan. And I want those answers just as much as he did. And I stood up and said when the president announced the withdrawal that I didn't support that withdrawal. But that is beside the point that we're dealing with now. Because what we're dealing with now and what my colleague from Missouri is doing is making us less secure. Because he's holding nominees, he's complaining about the problems we have in Russia and Ukraine, and he's making it worse. Because he's not willing to allow those nominees who can help with that problem to go forward. And he's absolutely incorrect about Nord Stream 2. I oppose Nord Stream 2. I authored the legislation with Senator Cruz to put Nord Stream 2, to sanction Nord Stream 2. And for the 4 years that the previous president was in office, they didn't take any action to sanction Nord Stream 2 until the day that Donald Trump left office. And the fact is that pipeline is not operating now because it hasn't been certified. And so Russia is not making any money from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So he needs to get his facts correct. He sits on the Armed Services Committee with me, where he has access to the same information about our pressing national security challenges. And yet he's holding up these nominees. He's disregarding the threats that we face because he'd rather stand here and grandstand on Afghanistan. Well, we do need to get answers, and I'm willing to work with them on that. But this is not the way to do it. So let's remember that Senator Hawley declared China as the biggest threat to American security. And that's a quote. And yet he's blocking the confirmation of Dr. Honey, who job would be to ensure that our defense research and development efforts are continuing on par with China. So if his goal is to ensure China's technological capabilities surpass ours, I can think of no better way to do that than to refuse to confirm Dr. Honey. On Russia, my colleague has claimed that the Biden administration has coddled Russia. We heard him say it just now, that they failed to aid Ukraine. But in a recent op-ed, my colleague made his views clear on the current Russian-created crisis. In it, he suggests that the U.S. is better off closing NATO's doors to Ukraine and stating that our nation's history of promoting and defending liberal democratic values across the globe has been a failure. Well, I'm not going to agree to that. We have an international order that developed after World War II that has had as a large part the containment, first of the Soviet Union through NATO, and now of Russia. And part of that world order says that a sovereign nation should be able to help determine their own future. So I'm not going to be part of some agreement that says we're going to turn our backs on NATO, we're going to turn our backs on Ukraine, and we're going to say to Russia, you go ahead, you go into Ukraine. He argues that we should reduce our commitments to places like Europe because he claims Russia poses a greater threat to our European allies than to the United States. Well, the last time I looked, when the United States got attacked in 2001, and maybe he doesn't remember 9/11 because he was too young, the countries that came to our aid were our NATO allies. So, with all due respect, I find my colleague's assessment both disturbing and shockingly uninformed. As members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, my colleague and I have been briefed on the multitude of evidence of Russia's attempts to subvert democratic institutions, including right here in the United States, by the way, to attack our own infrastructure, to compromise the sovereignty of our allies around the globe. In 2018, Russian private military contractor forces even assaulted an outpost of Americans in Syria. And they were forced to defend themselves, and of course they did, and they ultimately routed the Russian force. So my colleagues' stated sentiments do just what Vladimir Putin wants. He wants to divide the United States from our NATO allies and other democracies. He wants to diminish U.S. presence in Europe and to rewrite the European security order in a way that favors his authoritarian interests. We simply cannot allow that to happen, and I could not disagree with my colleague any more in how he has chosen to associate himself. Continuing to block qualified leaders such as Dr. Wallander, Dr. Honey, and Ms. Dalton does not make us stronger. It does not contribute to productive discourse over our national priorities, and it doesn't accomplish what he's trying to accomplish. If what he wants is answers on Afghanistan, then work with us. Let's work together. Let's make this commission that we passed in the NDAA, let's make it work. What he wants casts us as an unreliable partner to our allies, and it forces the Department of Defense to operate with one hand tied behind their backs. So I'm disappointed to hear my colleague, and he talks about regular order. Well, in the last 24 hours, we've confirmed 3 nominees by regular order. We held up the Senate to get cloture votes, and then we passed Alexandra Baker, the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, 75-21. We passed Douglas Bush, Assistant Secretary of the Army, 95-2. I don't know if Senator Hawley was one of those 2. I assume he was. And we passed Patrick Coffey, General Counsel for the Navy, 79-17. And then on February 2nd, by unanimous consent, we passed Gabriel Camarillo, Undersecretary of the Army, and Andrew Hunter, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, by unanimous consent. So this is not about regular order. This is about trying to use the Senate process for his own personal ambitions. And That's unfortunate, Mr. President. It's unfortunate because it doesn't get us, the individuals who we need to get confirmed to make government run. And it's unfortunate because it doesn't accomplish what he says he wants. So, Mr. President, I'm disappointed to hear that we are not going to move these nominees forward. And I hope at some point my colleague will reconsider. I yield the floor.